Good morning. Welcome to the first Florida Civic Advance webinar in 2023. Initially scheduled January 19th, taking place today, Wednesday, February 22nd. Uh, we showcase examples of civic excellence in Florida communities. And I'm Bob Jones, Florida Civic Advance board member, and we are a nonprofit membership network committed to working across sectors to improve civic health in Florida's communities. Next slide. So the civic challenge for Florida is uh, quite large. We're the third largest state in the country, but we rank amongst the weakest states in terms of civic health, covering such things as volunteering, helping neighbors, voting, fixing a community problem, etc. Over the our so to the next slide. We welcome membership in the organization. Individuals, organizations are invited to join, and there is information on the website regarding that and application. Next slide. So in 2022, we developed a set of priorities for Florida Civic Advance for a strategic framework for 2023 to 2025. And over the next years, our strategic priorities are to support civic health and community measurement, convene, showcase civic excellence, and serve our members in their civic efforts. We welcome you to join the FCA network. You will note that in terms of the program, you have a comment button, and on that, and we welcome questions as they come up as Rich and Sherry go through their presentations, and we will try and cover all the questions, and it will be displayed across the screen as they are submitted. So it's my honor now to introduce our presenter, Rich Harwood. His career is focused on transforming public and political lives by supporting individuals, organizations, and communities to support positive change. He's the president and founder of the Harwood Institute for Public Innovation. He is an author of 5 books. The latest or newest is Stepping Forward, scores of articles and reports on how communities can solve shared problems, bridging divides, and creating resilient communities. Rich grew up in upstate New York, attended Skidmore College, and gained a master's degree from Princeton in public administration. His early career focused on or featured work at Public Agenda at the national level and Jobs for the Future. He founded Harwood Institute in 1988, initially as a for-profit entrepreneurial organization. They later converted to a 501c3, a nonprofit, and in 1991 he published a groundbreaking report, Citizens in Politics: A View from Main Street. The institute operates both domestically and internationally. And he, among other things, over the years, back in, I think, in the early 2010s, he facilitated a Newtown, Connecticut unanimous decision on the fate of Sandy Hook Elementary. And his institute operates in 50 states and 40 countries with organizations such as United Way, Goodwill, AARP, American Libraries Association. So I'll introduce Sherry briefly, and then I'll turn it over to Rich for the program. So Sherry is a consultant to the Patterson Foundation based in Sarasota, and has had a 20-year public sector career, including serving as Manatee County Administrator. The bulk of her work has been in the community services, human and children's services fields. And in 2007, she was tapped to create the Manatee County Neighborhood Services Department. Her work with the foundation includes digital access for all initiatives and the Suncoast grade reading level, which received a recognition from the National Civic League in their All American Communities program, and building trust and strengthening communities. So, Rich, I'm going to pull up a slide about the responses, the many registrant responses to what they wanted to learn from this webinar, and then I'll turn it over to you. So I'll just highlight it's the who, what, and how, with emphasis on the how. The who is the Harwood Institute, the Patterson Foundation, the Kettering Foundation, Florida Civic Events, et cetera. Then what, the research study design, the diagnosis, the context, and then how, the tips, the steps, the methods, the strategies for getting past polarization and political divisiveness, increasing civic engagement in the community. So that we really appreciate all of that input, and it helped us to sort of think about the program itself. And I will then now turn it over to Rich for the presentation.
Great. Thanks so much, Bob. It is great to be great to be with everyone. Great to be with Sherry, my good friend from Sarasota, who we've worked together over many years now. And Bob and I were just talking before we started that he and I go back to 1990. So it's great to reconnect with him as well. I do want to talk about how we can move forward. And first, I'd like to just talk a little bit about where I think we are, because I think how we move forward is dependent on a better understanding of where we really are as a country right now and as a people. You know, we're coming through hard times. I don't need to remind us about that, whether it's COVID, our politics, the changing economy that we're all experiencing, or an attempt at a reckoning with social justice and racism in our country. I think people in the country are yearning to be part of something larger than themselves. They're yearning to get our country in motion again, to get us moving, to create more progress for more of us, to figure out how we can each be part of America's promise moving forward. But it's no surprise to you, and it's no news, that we are stuck as a country right now, and many of our communities are stuck as well. And the question is, how can we move forward? Many people would say that we're not going to be able to move forward because we're polarized, that we are too polarized as a nation, we are too polarized as people, we are too polarized in our communities in order to move forward. And my message to you today, as loudly and as clearly as I possibly can say, is that I believe this notion of polarization is an explanation and an excuse for inaction. An explanation and an excuse for inaction. I believe that there is something happening in the country that is more profound and perilous and dangerous than polarization. And that's what I want to talk about, and then how we can address it. Some time ago, a couple of years ago, I took essentially a walk across the country during COVID, so it was all virtual, and spoke to Americans in 16 different communities, groups of Americans, cross sections, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, people from all walks of life. We talked to folks in the most rural county in Western Kansas, to Houston, Texas, to New Orleans, to Eugene, Oregon, to Spartanburg, South Carolina, which is one of the most conservative counties in all of America. And as we held these conversations, if I sent you the transcripts of these conversations and I took off or erased or marked off the names of the communities of each of these communities and specific references to something in their town, what I want to tell you is that while there are real differences in our country, no doubt, that you could not tell one transcript from another or one community from another, that we share that much in common in our country. And particularly, we share that much in common about what I want to talk about today. And what we found in the country is there's three main things that I just want to highlight for you today that is a response to polarization, a different way to look at what's actually happening in the country, and a way to think about how we can then begin to move forward. First is this: what people told us is that we are separating and segregating from one another at a far faster rate than ever before in America. Now, we all know that this country was founded on separation and segregation. And we have been riddled by that throughout our history. But the separation and segregation that's occurring today is happening to everyone in every part of their lives. We are separating and segregating into smaller and smaller groups because we are so anxious about what's happening in our country. We are so anxious about what's happening in our individual lives. And let me say clearly that while COVID exacerbated this anxiety and this separation and segregation, it wasn't the start of it. This started long before then. And that in holding this anxiety about what's happening in our country, in our lives, we are making faster and faster judgments to be able to sort each other into different groups. So for instance, what people told us is based on the hat that you're wearing, maybe it is a red baseball hat. We make assumptions about who you are, what you believe, and what you think ought to happen in our communities based on a t-shirt that might have a slogan on it. We are making judgments about who you are, what you believe, and what you think needs to happen based on a bumper sticker that we might see on the back of your car when we're driving behind you, or we go into a parking lot to go to the local store. We're making judgments about who you are. And the fact is, we've never talked to each other. We've never had a conversation. We've never explored what we believe or what we feel or what we're experiencing in our lives, except now, because of the anxiety, because we are separating and segregating ourselves so much, we are making these quick judgments. Two, what people say is that our politicians, our news media, and our social media are intentionally manufacturing and stoking division in our country. Intentionally manufacturing and stoking division and what might be called polarization for their own political gain, to gain votes, to gain audience, to gain people in social media, right? It's happening in Florida right now, each and every day. And what people are saying to us is that this noise is enveloping them. This noise from our politicians, this noise from the news media, the noise they experience when they go into social media, that this noise is enveloping them and it's it's disorienting us. It's creating confusion. It's creating a sense that we don't know what's happening. And increasingly, we can't tell what is true and what is fiction, which end is up and which end is down, who to believe and who we can't believe, which makes it very difficult to navigate the changes and challenges that we're experiencing, whether it's COVID, a changing economy, our changing politics, our changing race relations, and the need to have a reckoning with social justice and racism. Any of these challenges and others like climate change as well, and education, it makes it difficult to figure out how we can move forward. And so the third point is this. We Americans, we people, us folks, what we're having a natural human reaction to the stress and the strain that we're under, the noise that we're experiencing. And what people told us is that they have engaged in a response of fight or flight. Now, this isn't a phrase that I came up with. This is a phrase that we heard in so many of these conversations that we held across the country. In fact, in almost every single conversation from multiple people in each conversation, that we are engaged in a human response or fight or flight. We flee because we believe that the noise is overwhelming, that we're going to end up in acrimonious and divisive discussions, that we're going to be attacked for what we believe. And so many of us are retreating from public life and community life altogether. Others of us are entering public life to engage in a fight, to win at any cost, to ensure that our point of view is heard at any cost, to push people back, to push them away, to push them into the corner, to shame them and embarrass them, and in some cases to weaponize our agendas so that we can win. Increasingly, what people are telling us in this fight or flight, which is a basic response, when we ask them, well, what are you after? Here's what people told us. They said, we are looking for a sense of acceptance in society. We are looking for a sense of validation. We're looking for a sense of belonging, and we can't find it in our larger communities and in our society. And so we are joining smaller and smaller groups. This is another form of separating and segregating from one another. We are joining political groups. We are joining pressure groups and advocacy groups. Some of us are going online and we're finding ourselves going down rabbit holes. And ultimately, we find ourselves even confronting and engaging with hate groups, right? With hate groups. And what people tell us about joining with all these groups, they'll say really quickly, Rich, it's not that I agree with everything that these groups stand for. In fact, there's many things that I may not agree with, but they accept me. They validate me. They create a sense of belonging for me. There's a home for me here. And so what people are saying to us is that they want a home that they can belong to, a sense of belonging that they need. And so when you look at these three findings that came out of these conversations that we held across the country, and frankly, that are affirmed each and every day that I do work in communities all across this country, what we face is not so much a political problem, a big P political problem, which is how the news media would like to frame it. It's how our politicians certainly would like to frame it. It's what takes place in social media. It's not so much a political polarization problem. It's a individual and social psychological dilemma about how do I make my way in the world? How do I navigate this noisy, crazy place? How do I find a sense of acceptance and validation and belonging and community with others? How can I get a shot at pursuing and fulfilling America's promise as we move forward? Now, you might think as I heard these things across the country that I lost hope. I didn't. In fact, I have an abundance of hope about how we can move forward. And I just want to share with you three examples of where I find hope in America today. Practical examples of where I find hope. Now, each of you listening, as I say these three examples, I'm sure you have your own examples, maybe more than I do. And I ask you, as I say my examples, for you to think about your own. So here's the first one. It deals with education, Reading, Pennsylvania. Reading 10 years ago was declared the poorest community of all of America. It was once predominantly white in manufacturing. The manufacturing base has left, and now it is predominantly Latino, over 60%. Some people may say it's more homogeneous than it was before, but in fact, it's more diverse than ever before because folks come from 6 or 7 different Latin countries. It's very diverse with different customs, different heritage, different dialect, right? Different use of language. A couple of years ago, we started a project there with local individuals to see if we could create a shared agenda around education. When we started this work, this was at the very same time, much like in Florida, that there were debates about critical race theory, debates about whether or not kids should wear masks in schools, debates about banning books, debates about school board upheavals and running school superintendents out of town. At the very same time that those debates were occurring across the country, we were working in Reading, Pennsylvania with folks from all across the community. And they didn't fall prey to those culture debates that are holding us hostage. Instead, they were able to come together and generate a shared agenda around education, around the mental health of our children, around early childhood education, around English as a second language, around ensuring that teachers look like the communities that they're teaching. They had a whole bunch of agenda items. Not only did they come together and produce this agenda, but 3 teams formed on specific issues and they started to take action, and they're doing that now. Not only that, but as our work has unfolded, I was just in Reading recently, more and more people are joining this work to spread it across the community and make it real. It can happen. We can overcome the fight or flight. We can overcome the manufactured polarization, and we can overcome these culture debates that are holding us hostage. Now, you might think Reading is an aberration, but here's the thing. At the very same time we were working with folks in Reading, We were working independently with folks in Clarksville, Tennessee, a very different community, but they too produced a shared agenda around education and equity concerns, and they're moving forward on it. And if you think Clarksville, Tennessee is an aberration, we were working with folks in Lexington County, or Lexington and Fayette County in Kentucky, and they too produced a shared agenda, and they too are moving forward on it now. Now, if you think those three examples don't work because somehow my institute was involved with them, well, Sherry's here to talk later about the work that she helped to spearhead in DeSoto County, Florida, where folks there came together amid the same debates and produced their own agenda to move forward. And when Hurricane Ian hit, they didn't stop. They couldn't take action on their agenda, but they came together with the trust and the relationships and the connections and the community that they built. And they became good neighbors in supporting people to address their concerns about the hurricane and their needs after the hurricane. It can happen. It can happen. And it is happening across the country. The second example is from Clark County, Kentucky, a rural county, and many counties in Florida are rural counties. This county's been riddled by divisions over religion, race, geography, newcomers versus old timers. The kids there told us, even though they were going to blue ribbon schools, they felt abandoned by their parents. Parents, too many of whom are now addicted to opioids and meth and fentanyl, who can't provide the support they need for the children that they have. So as we were working there, this is just one small example of many things that came out of this work in Clark County. Two women, neither of whom are a doctor, a nurse practitioner, but they were concerned about the opioid and meth addiction problems in their community that were running rampant. And they were sitting in church one day and they heard about a conference also in Kentucky that they could go to learn about how to combat this addiction problem. And so on their own nickel, together, these two women, again, not physicians, not nurses, not medical professionals, they went to this conference and they learned how they could create a new approach to addressing addiction in their community. It's an approach that a lot of communities are using, but it wasn't being used in Clark County. They came back, and what they realized was when someone goes to the emergency room after overdosing from drugs, what happens? They get detoxed. The medical profession makes sure that they're in stable condition. And then what? They're pushed right back onto the streets. And what happens? They have a relapse. And here we go again. It's a repetitive process over and over and over again. What they told us was when people went to the emergency room, they didn't feel a sense of empathy from anyone. Instead, they felt judged and condemned, which only created more shame in them, which only when they left the ER prompted them to fall into a relapse again for comfort and a sense of solace, maybe a sense of security. So instead, what happens now is that these two women trained folks who themselves are in recovery. And when someone overdoses and goes to the ER, they send one of these coaches to the ER to meet them. Individuals who are empathetic, individuals who know what these folks who have overdosed are going through, individuals who know what it means to try to kick their habit and improve their lives and move forward on a different path, a more hopeful path. And so what happened is when these coaches went to meet people, not only did they stay with them while they detoxed, they literally followed them out of the emergency room. And not only did they follow them out of the emergency room, they made sure they got home. And when they made sure they got home, they called them the next day and started to work with them about how they could find employment if they didn't have a job or how they could gain new job skills. They made sure that a social network wrapped their arms around these individuals because we know that your social connections are as important as your medical treatment when you're trying to overcome addiction. And lo and behold, over time, these two women created a storefront where people could go and find a sense of belonging and validation and acceptance, a home, a sense of community. And their work continues to this day. Their work continues to this day. It just goes to show that we have innate capabilities in our communities. I've come to believe that we leave on the table, I don't know, 80, 85% of our innate capabilities and talents on the table in our communities. We don't even tap them, in part because we don't have them in our line of sight. Here's the third example, and Bob mentioned this in the introduction. Back in 2012, you all remember the Newtown massacre. 20 first graders were gunned down and 6 adults. Florida has had its own share of gun violence, whether it's in Orlando or Parkland and in many other places. I'm going to Norfolk, Virginia tomorrow, and just this week, there was yet another shooting where someone died. Back in 2012, the mayor of Newtown, just weeks after this massacre, called me on the phone and asked me whether or not I would come to Newtown to design and lead a process by which the community could decide what to do with the Sandy Hook Elementary School. At first, I said no. I wasn't sure that I had anything to offer. I wasn't sure how I could lead this community forward. And then after thinking about it for a while, I decided that I actually had an obligation to step forward, to bring my experiences from other hard-hit communities, to bring my own personal experiences from my own personal trauma to do this work. She had set up a task force of 28 elected officials from 4 different governing boards, which frankly was a recipe for a political disaster. These officials didn't get along between their governing boards, and in many cases, there was strife on each governing board. But nonetheless, she brought them together to figure out how the community could move forward and how the community could figure out what to do with this school building. What I learned real quick was that this really wasn't about a school building at all. It was about how a community could take its first public steps to move from trauma and despair to healing and hope. Over the next few months, this task force that the mayor set up met in public. Every meeting was covered by CNN, by the New York Times, by the Wall Street Journal. There were scores and banks of television cameras and reporters and radio microphones. Each meeting we heard from survivors, from people who had lost a child, from people who had went to this school, alumni who wanted to make sure the school remained open. We heard from townspeople. The day before we were about to make an announcement that this task force, after 3 meetings, was ready to make a decision about how to move forward, a group of 30 teachers released a letter. It ran in the Wall Street Journal. I got a phone call. I was sitting at my home that morning and got a call from the mayor's office saying, look at the Wall Street Journal and read about this letter. These 30 teachers said that under no conditions would they ever go back to this school or even this site where the school now stood. So I flew up to Newtown that night, which was supposed to be the day that we were going to make our final decision as a task force. And there were hundreds of people, 3, 4 rows deep, all around us in this council chambers where we held each of these meetings. All the television cameras were there, the reporters, the radio stations. They were all there to cover what we were going to do. This was national news. And I had to stand up in the middle of this meeting when we first convened it and say, I'm going to have to ask everyone to leave the room, because for the first and only time, we're going to hold a private session. And we invited the 30 teachers into the room as others left. And for the next, 90 minutes or 2 hours, I had one of the most harrowing experiences I've ever had, where these teachers told of the story of hearing the gunshots ring throughout the hallways at Sandy Hook Elementary School, where some of them stowed their children in their classrooms in closets or storage rooms or underneath desks, where some of them barricaded the doors to their classrooms, where some of them heard the gunmen come down the hall and mow people down, where people lost their colleagues, where people talked about what it was like now to have children back in school and dealing with all of their concerns and fears each and every day. And so when the conversation ended, which was just The task force, these 30 teachers, myself, and 2 mental health professionals, we opened the room up again and let everyone back in. And I stood up and said, as much as we would like to make a decision tonight, tonight's not the night to make a decision. The task force was beside themselves about what they had just heard. They weren't sure anymore about what needed to be done. And so I said we'd reconvene in 2 weeks. And when we did come back in 2 weeks, and all the people filled this room again, it looked as though we were going to be gridlocked, that we were at an impasse, that different groups on the task force wanted to move in fundamentally different ways. And I had been told that morning by news media folks who had called me saying, after the third meeting, we told you this would never work. We told you there would be an impasse. We told you this was a bad idea. And so when I went up back to Newtown for this last meeting, it appeared as though they might be right. But I knew in my heart that they were wrong. I knew based on experience that we could move through this. And over the next 3 hours, well into the evening, the task force met. And eventually, one leader from one of the factions said, it looks like we're not going to make progress. We're going to have to put aside some of our own views, and we're going to have to come together for the good of the community. And so one by one, people began to coalesce around one of the options that we had. And by the end of that night, which was well after midnight, the task force not only decided how to move forward, they decided to move forward unanimously. And it just goes to show that we can move from trauma and despair to healing and hope, but that we can only do it. We can only do it if we're willing to listen to one another. We can only do it if we're willing to see and hear one another. We can only do it if we begin to understand that we're not going to be able to get everything that we want all the time, and that we are going to have to compromise. We are going to have to find common ground amid our real differences. Amid our real differences. And so I find hope from these 3 examples, and I hope that as I was talking to you about them, they reminded you of your own experiences that you've seen. And so the question now is, how can we move forward? How can we move forward? And I want to offer you 5 concrete things that I think we need to focus on. They're not the be all and the end all, but what I know is that if we don't do at least these 5 things, it's going to be nearly impossible to move forward. So I hope you're still with me here. I hope you're still with me. And when I talk about these 5 things, here's what I want you to think about. This notion of how we do the work is as important as what we do. How we do the work is as important as what we do. You ready? Okay, 5 things. I'll try to go through them briefly. Number 1, we need to start to talk about what we are for in this country, not simply what we are against. We are awash in negativity. We are really practiced and good at talking about the things we don't like, the things we don't want, the people we don't like, the people we don't trust. It's not getting us anywhere. In fact, it's taking us further and further into an impasse and into gridlock. Too often, if we engage people at all, we engage them around their problems. But what happens? All we end up with is a long laundry list of challenges that people want us to address. And then they want to know why these haven't been solved. When they haven't been solved, they want to know who was responsible. When they find out who was responsible, they want to cast aspersions and point fingers. And before you know it, we're in a toxic cul-de-sac of public discourse that we're riddled by every day in our lives today. When we don't ask people about problems, we take a different path. And some of you may have taken this path. And I hope I don't insult anyone when I mention this. But we end up creating utopian visions, right? We do these visioning exercises, right? Where we put the little yellow dots next to things and say, don't say too much, just put the dots what you believe in or what you value. No need to talk about it. We're just going to add it up and move forward. And if you've ever noticed, these end up being these reports that are in 4-color and saddle stitch and usually have 150 recommendations and 15 or 20 task forces. And well, they don't usually go anywhere, right? They usually end up on the shelf or in the garbage can when you're cleaning out your files. And the reason why, there are lots of reasons, but one central reason is because I've never met an American who wants to deal with utopian visions. We're practical folks and we want to get things done, right? And so here's an alternative. I think if we want to focus on what we're for, we need to focus on our shared aspirations, aspirations that come from our gut and hold meaning in our lives and that are actionable, achievable, and doable. Shared aspirations that when we articulate them together, we begin to realize that we hold some things in common, even amid our real differences. Shared aspirations that when we hear them, they implicate us. And we begin to see that no one organization, no one group, no one individual, no one heroic leader can save us, but that we're going to have to pull together to create these shared aspirations together. So that's number one. I think we have to learn how to articulate what we are for. And what I can tell you in our work at the Institute is that when we do, we can change the frame of reference in communities about what matters to people, which unlocks our ability to move forward together in a new way. Second, we need to build together more. We need to build together more. Now, some of my friends in the dialogue community would have us believe that we just need to hold more forums and everything will be okay. But honestly, the work that I've done over the last 35 years in communities has demonstrated to me that we can't talk our way out of the challenges that we face and to create a pathway forward. More talk isn't going to do it. More talk alone isn't going to do it. We need to build. We need to create things together. We need to demonstrate that we can actually make things happen together. And when we do, we begin to recognize that we have hidden talents, hidden gifts, hidden resources in our communities that we can tap into. We begin to discover partnerships that we never could have imagined otherwise. There is a civic joy that occurs when you build something with someone else, right? There's research on this. There's a civic joy that gets released chemically in our bodies about co-creating something with someone else and beginning to see that we actually have the capabilities, the knowledge, the know-how, and the wisdom to do things together. That when we fail and things don't work, we actually can get back up and keep moving and keep going down a path. And so I think we need to put more emphasis on coming together to build things together to make things happen, which leads me to my third point. The first one is we've got to figure out more of what we're for. The second one is we've got to build together. The third one is we have to think about how change actually happens. Now, a lot of us like to talk about theories of change. You know, those things we put up on whiteboards. They are all often pretty complex and complicated about how we think change happens, or it's really how we think change should happen. But I don't know about you, but I've never seen very many theories of change work out. And the reason why is because they're usually untethered from reality. They're the ways in which we want things to happen, not the ways in which they actually do happen. And so a few years ago at the Institute, we decided to undertake what we call a 30-year impact study. We looked at 9 communities where we had worked for a few years, but where people worked together long after we left, to discover how change actually happened. How did it actually happen? And here's what we learned. What we learned is that change almost always started with a small action that unleashed a chain reaction of actions that grew over time and spread over time in the community. That this chain reaction you never could have fully predicted. You never could have fully predicted what action people would take, who their partners might be, and what it might produce. You could be intentional about creating this chain reaction. You need to be open to serendipity in creating this chain reaction, but you can't control it. You can't control it. And so one of the things that I think, if we want to regain a sense of trust in society, a sense of belief that we can make things happen, a sense that we can be part of America's promise, a sense that we can get out of the gridlock and impasse that we're stuck in, a sense that we can remove ourselves from this fight or flight and re-engage with one another again. It's going to require us building the civic confidence that we can actually come together and do things. And to do that, To do that, I think we're going to have to focus much more on how is it we can catalyze and grow a chain reaction of change that doesn't diminish in momentum or in impact over time, but in fact grows a new trajectory of hope over time. So that's number 3. Number 4, I'll try to move through these quickly. Number 4, I think we need more catalytic, boundary spanning organizations in our communities. More boundary spanning, catalytic organizations in our communities. As you know, we have a ton of organizations that provide good services and do good deeds. But as I work in communities every day, what I find is that we don't have enough organizations that bring us together across dividing lines, that help catalyze action, that in catalyzing action help us marshal our collective and shared resources so that we can move forward. That in catalyzing this action often will get out of the way and allow someone else to take the lead to move things forward because they're better equipped or better able to do it. We need more of these organizations, and we need to invest in more of these organizations. In so many of the communities where we're working today, where the Institute is working, we find hardly any of these catalytic boundary spanning organizations that can help us move forward, or not nearly enough that can enable us to move forward. And when we do bring these groups together, when we do create these places where we can bring folks together across boundary lines, across dividing lines, to marshal our shared resources, I want to be clear about something. This isn't simply about more collaboration. You know, collaboration is one of those $5 words that we all use in grant proposals and talk a lot about. But what I keep finding in our work is that when we bring folks together, we talk about collaboration, but we seldom actually work together. We actually seldom have the hard conversations we really need to have. We actually seldom think about not how do we create more things, but how do we create fewer things that are better focused. We seldom think enough about how do we think about the real levers of change as opposed to creating one of these visioning exercises that has 150 levers of change. In communities like Lexington, Kentucky, where we're working, people have said to me, we have so much collaboration and so many plans of action, but we're not getting enough done because we don't actually work together. We don't do the hard work that's required to work together. And so when we do create these catalytic boundary spanning organizations, let's not make the mistake of simply just trying to do the typical usual collaboration that's just going to stall us and create more frustration in our communities. Last point is about our narratives. What I've found in my 35 years of experience is that the greatest hidden factor about whether or not communities move forward, the greatest hidden factor, is the shared narratives we have about ourselves and our communities. In too many communities, the narratives is that we can't move forward. The narrative might be that we're waiting for a mayor to get elected to save us. In Las Vegas, where I work, the narrative was, I'm for me and you're for me. In Youngstown, Ohio, where I work, the narrative around education was, none of these kids have the potential to learn. They're just all going to end up in jail. These narratives shape our attitudes, our actions, our behaviors, our beliefs, and they stall us and prevent us from coming together and taking action and having confidence in ourselves and in one another. And so I think we need to pay more attention to how we create a new can-do narrative in our communities and across states like Florida. But it's not going to be about hiring public relations firms that come up with a new slogan and try to make us believe something that we know isn't true. These new narratives are going to come from the actions that we're taking in our communities, that we identify, that we lift up, that we shine a light on, that we learn how to tell new stories about. But here's the thing. In so much of the work that you and I do and others, we don't see these changes that we're creating. They're invisible to us because we're so knee-deep in the work. And we're taught that we're only allowed to talk about our progress when we're at the end and we've fulfilled all our metrics. So at the Institute, we created a tool called Making the Invisible Visible, which we're using in communities all over the place, which is to help people to identify the progress that they're making as they're making it over time, so that they can tell an unfolding story that's happening over time. so that they can make installments in this story so that people can see what's actually happening, including where they fall down and fail and need to get back up and find a new path. I think if we want to move the country forward, if we want to move our communities forward, one of the basic things we need to focus on is how we create new can-do narratives in our communities. Let me just end with this. I'm going to cut out a whole part of my talk because I'm running late here. I just want to end with this thought. I think today, one of the challenges that we're facing is that in this fight or flight mode that we're in the noise that's enveloped our society, our public square has become increasingly naked. It's being hijacked by those with the loudest voices, those with the most acrimonious messages, those who are weaponizing their agendas and pushing others away. And in the process, those of us who want to act in good faith, those of us who want to find a way to come together with others, those of us who believe that we can do better, those of us who believe in our innate capabilities to come together, those of us who believe we need to marshal our shared resources to move forward, those of us who believe still in America's promise and the need to co-create a new America's promise moving forward. Well, so many of us have been pushed to the edges of the public square. So many of us have retreated from the middle of the public square to the edges where it's safer, where we believe we can survive easier and better, where we believe we might be able to raise more money more easily and better, where we believe that we can narrow our agendas and hit our metrics or hit the metrics that fit these narrower agendas, and we can declare success better and more easily. And if I have a message to you today, it's this. We face a fundamental choice in our country. You face a fundamental choice in your communities in the state of Florida and across our country. Will we surrender the public square to those with the loudest voices who are most acrimonious, who are most divisive, who are often most hateful and bigoted and prejudiced? Or will we run back into the middle of the public square and reclaim it? To do that, I think we need to focus on the 5 things that I mentioned today as down payments on creating a more equitable, a more fair and just, a more inclusive, a more hopeful society moving forward. Thanks so much for having me. I look forward to engaging in a conversation. I look forward to having Sherry engage in this conversation because she brings so much wisdom and experience to these questions.
Thank you, Rich. I think we can all say that once we hear about those 5 messages and we talk about the can-do attitude, the can-do is now. And from the Patterson Foundation's work with the Harwood Institute and building aspirations to action, it has been all about, as Rich mentioned, trust. And we know that the speed of trust is only built as we move through working with people and organizations, even the communities. And I wanted to just provide an example because as you listen to Rich, you say, now what can I do? How can we move forward? And so from here, from where we're sitting at today, what I'd say is don't wait. Be that person, be that catalytic individual, be that organization to move forward. And one of the examples that we can provide about this is the work that we have done in DeSoto County, Florida, a community of about 38,000 in a rural agricultural area and ready to come together and to work. But first, we had to go in and build that trust. So bringing groups together, and I loved how Rich mentioned the smaller groups because we found that to be the most catalytic portion of the work. Bringing small groups of people together that at that moment are comfortable being there, but haven't shared their aspirations. And this took place in another interesting way with our team with Aspirations to Action with the youth in the community. We hadn't planned on that, but that was one of the first groups that we were able to reach. And as we did, we found they had amazing aspirations to bring forward, things that were possible. Finding out who else cares in the community to help support them, to help bring them forward. not for us to lead that change and be the people that stand up, but to look at them as those that can start that movement. We're in about our 14th session, and it has taken a little longer than we had expected. Our team wanted to be done with and ready to move on to that next level, as Rich was mentioning about bringing things out. But a little thing called Hurricane Ian came up. And I will say to this group here on today is that one of the most amazing things that happened at that time in this community with these conversations is that because they had started speaking to each other, because they had started building their aspirations, they were not set back by the hurricane. They were inspired to continue working. They had met each other. They had met each other in new realms, and they continued to make progress. And so, as we meet in these groups, over 300 different people have come forward. And other examples of progress are they've made their own groups. They have smaller groups. They meet on a regular basis. And now it's time. It's time to come back together and do one of the main things. And I mentioned this to Rich that they asked us about was how will movements like these be sustained? The word sustainability. Everyone was afraid to start because they were afraid it wouldn't be sustainable. However, with the conversations that you're able to have and the aspirations that you bring forward, many of those hurdles are tackled by finding people in the groups that are willing to step forward, that are willing to take responsibility for keeping things moving in their community, and that sustainability starts to build. So we're thrilled to continue to be a part of Aspirations to Action with the Patterson Foundation and to have that ability for a more inclusive set of conversations to bring about collective abundance in a community and to build trust so that that community can move forward. Thank you.
Go ahead, Bob.
So, Rich and Sherry, thank you so much. I was making notes on the steps, and I think the registrants on this webinar were really interested in the concrete steps, and I really appreciate that you kind of laid out pretty pragmatic, practical questions. There was a question in the earlier webinar learning items that really asked the question: how can you start a conversation in a community that is focused on equity and racial justice? And given the moment here in Florida, how would you suggest we might kind of approach or attack that?
Yeah, well, what I would say is what people in communities have told me. So in Reading, Lexington, and Clarksville, this work started around educational equity and racial justice. That was the mandate. And what we've learned, what we knew going in and what we've learned in other places like Alamance County, North Carolina, where I just was a week ago, we were having very difficult conversations about race, equity, and racial justice, is that when you start by talking to people about their shared aspirations, and when you start by being radically inclusive in these conversations, it opens up a pathway for people to talk about what they really value, what they need, what their concerns are. And invariably, like in Reading, they created an agenda that they consider an equity agenda. But they didn't start with equity and racial justice. They started with what are their shared aspirations for the community? What is it they want to create in their community to create a better community moving forward and to ensure every youth and child can succeed in their communities? And so what that did, and what in Alamance County, people who do diversity, equity, and inclusion work, I can send these quotes out, said was, it's really interesting, Rich. We use all of this work, and what we find is it keeps pushing people away from the table. It keeps putting labels on people before we've had a conversation. And it often divides us, and we try to create these comprehensive plans. And what I've learned through this work is that if we can focus on our shared aspirations and not create comprehensive plans, but to begin to think about where we can start to build together and take action, we can actually get things moving. And here's the thing, Bob. In Clark County, Kentucky, where this happened, they had a history of slavery. They had tried for 20 or 30 years to address this history and to address racial equity issues, and they failed. It was only when they started to do this work in a different approach that they ultimately realized that they began to first reckon with their history, which they did publicly. They began to deal with some of the systemic issues. And here's the thing, during COVID, groups that had never come together or worked together, in fact, never wanted to work together, in fact, didn't want to work together, came together twice a week for well over a year to begin to address systemic issues, including issues around racial equity and other equity concerns. But they took a different path, and I think that's important.
Yeah, that's really a critical framing for the conversation, and I think you were describing how is more important than what, and that how you can frame that conversation to elicit the aspirations and then ultimately to take action together is a critical thing that I think a takeaway from your point. Could you offer just a couple of more examples of boundary spanning organizations?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah,
I think, well, first, the Patterson Foundation is a quintessential boundary spanning organization. So I'll mention that, and maybe Sherry can come back to it and talk about it, because I think they're one of the best examples in the country. I think another group like them is a group, Impact Alamance, that we're working with in Alamance County, North Carolina, and their entire role, their work is around social determinants and equity.
right.
They're our main partner.
Yeah,
And what they do is they see their mission as not creating programs that they run, but sparking others to create things and do things together that they then hand off to other folks, that other folks take. So it's both a mindset and a set of practices in doing this work. There might be some librarians on this call. We've done work with hundreds, if not thousands, of libraries across the country. Libraries are actually one of the last boundary spanning organizations in our communities. They cover entire communities and counties. They bring people together from all walks of life. And in using our work, they began to more intentionally bring folks together in the community to articulate what they're for and to create change in the community that the library didn't take hold of, but they sparked. I have a book out that I just want to do a quick plug for because it deals with this, Bob. And yes, I'm shamelessly plugging this book, which I tend not to do. This book called Unleash, which has these stories from these 9 communities that I mentioned before. And in those stories, every story has a boundary spanning organization that helped to catalyze this change. And each of those boundary spanning organizations were different from the others, right? They weren't
okay.
all this. And so it's more the characteristics that the organization has than the type of organization that it is.
Yeah. Sherry, you have any?
Yeah, I think exactly what Rich said with the Patterson Foundation, mainly the main goal, strengthening people, organizations, and communities. That's again not taking the responsibility and forcing something, but allowing individuals to be able to elevate their thoughts, aspirations for positive change.
Great. I walk away from this conversation with a lot of renewed hope, and renewed hope in the sense of practical ways to initiate and frame conversations that bring the community together, review aspirations, and build upon those aspirations to create actions that are needed. So I thank Rich, I thank you and Sherry for joining us and presenting these ideas. And I'll just mention on the way out, we have about a minute left. We do have past FCA webinar programs on our website. So if you're interested, I've covered a whole range of different ideas and initiatives. Next slide. So our next webinar is March 23rd, and it's titled When Civic Scholarship Meets Civic Practice. And it's going to be highlighting the University of Miami's experience, their Civic and Community Engagement Center Dr. Robert Backen. Jim Murley, who's our president of the Florida Civic events, is also the chief resilience officer of Miami-Dade County. And then Alex Chow, who is a former student, graduated in 22, but he's now working at HUD on questions of affordable housing and the like. So, at any rate, we will welcome you to that. Our website is on the screen, and encourage you to review our membership benefits and application. And again, thank you to everyone, and thank you especially to Rich and Sherry for really enlightening and positive uh, program, and with a lot of actionable ideas.